Last week we did a little field trip in our class to another book by Tom Rainer called The Autopsy of a Deceased Church. I was trying to encourage everyone and make everyone feel real excited and joyful about churches that closed. Wait, that's weird, right? Churches that closed. So it was more like, let's take an honest look at what went wrong in a lot of different churches that had this slow decline and eventually had to close their doors. The thought is, if we can recognize the signs of a church on decline, it'll give us an opportunity to take a hard look in the mirror and say, let's make sure we address things early rather than let them become these huge issues where at some point it's too late. At some point you're talking about how do we close well instead of how do we turn this around? Now, after class, a lot of people said, or a couple of people told me, they really appreciated the info, but it was kind of depressing, talking about churches that had to close. And they also said, we didn't talk about what we should be doing better or instead. Well, at the end of this month, there's another book. It's not Autopsy of a Deceased Church. It's The Anatomy of a Revived Church. And it looks at some churches that were kind of sensing, okay, we are going to be on that decline. But instead of those churches kind of doubling down on everything that had previously gone wrong, they actually said, let's make some changes. And it tells the stories of several churches that had a turnaround. So we're gonna talk through that book at the end of this month too, because I don't want to leave you hanging on such a bad note. But so that's what we'll do. Last week we just talked about 10 of those traits that were common in some of those churches that closed. If you missed last week, I've got the handout over here. You could also pick up that book for yourself, Autopsy of a Deceased Church. It's not too expensive, and it's a pretty quick read. So today, what we're going to do is we're back in I Will by Tom Rainer. It's chapter 5, and the chapter there is about I will go. I will go. So kind of the idea that we're going to go for today is our goal should be to share the love of Jesus with people who need him. And not only people who show up at Southwest Church of Christ for a worship service. It's not just minister to the people who come. It's also we need to be proactive in going out into the community to find people who haven't had a relationship with Jesus yet. So last week when we talked about the autopsy of a deceased church, number 5 on the list of common traits of churches that were in decline and eventually had to close was that the Great Commission, which is Jesus telling his disciples to go into all the world and make disciples, baptize them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The Great Commission became the Great Omission, which means we know Jesus told us to do that, but we're not really going to put it into practice. So we're kind of neglecting the mission that Jesus gave the church. So it's not hard to see how a church that ignores the Great Commission would eventually shrink and then have to close. So that's kind of the theme from a story that Tom Rainer tells in that chapter about a church called Twin Springs Church. It's a fake name. He didn't want to call anyone out by name, so it's a fictional name, but the story is real. And you can tell me if this story sounds familiar compared to maybe other congregations that you've been a part of or other congregations that you've heard of before. But basically, in the 50s, a group of really devoted Christians came together. There was about 7 families, and they all sensed together this calling from God to go out and start a new church, a new congregation in a growing part of the community. They recognized that they had a strong faith. They wanted to share the love of Jesus with others. This growing part of the community needed a great church, and so they started a church. And from about 1955 to 1985, the community was growing really, really rapidly. The church was growing really rapidly too. And so in the span of 30 years, they grew from 7 families that started the church to about 450 people on an average Sunday morning. And all of that sort of peaked in 1985. And there wasn't any kind of huge event or scandal or catastrophe that happened in the church. It's just that in 1985, they stopped growing. And in fact, when you look back in hindsight, you could recognize that was the turning point because they stopped growing, they plateaued, and for the next 30 years after that, they actually started to decline slowly. They weren't just staying the same, they actually lost about 1 church member every month for 30 years. So from 450 at the peak in 85, you lose 1 person every month. 30 years later, you're down to 90 people on a Sunday morning. And they're stuck in a building that's too big. They can't afford it. It's been years and years since they've been able to afford any kind of ministry staff. And so this church is, if it hasn't already closed, because this book is a few years old now, then it probably will soon. So what happened in this church, Tom Rainer talks about kind of what went wrong and some of the things that they could have done differently but didn't, is that they never developed a culture of going into the community. He says they never developed the DNA of going. So the reason they were able to grow is because the community around them was experiencing rapid growth. So they planted themselves in this part of town where it was growing rapidly. Tons of people were moving into their area, and there were enough people randomly moving into the community who just so happened to be looking for a church that their church grew kind of by default. They didn't have to do anything. They didn't have to work hard at it. They just experienced basically passive growth because they were in the right part of town, and there were enough Christians moving into the area who wanted a church to go to. That ended up being somewhat of a curse for them because their growth came so easily that they never developed the muscles necessary to keep growing when that community growth stopped. So here's the way that Tom Rainer explains it. It's on your handout on the back on page 2 on the left side. So the community that Twin Springs, the community, the city, was growing rapidly through 1985. The church benefited from the demographic growth of Twin Springs. I think there's one more sentence in there that I left off of the slide. Although its growth was not nearly as rapid as that of the community. It was indeed simple. As the community grew, the church grew. The members and leaders of the church hardly had any intentional outreach or evangelism to the community. Twin Springs Church basically let people know the doors were open, and they came. At least they came until 1985. The church never developed a DNA of going. They rarely reached out beyond their own walls. The members became more inwardly focused. They focused more and more on their comfort and needs. The decline was inevitable and tragic. Do you kind of understand the dynamic that was at play in that church? They were in the right place at the right time. Enough people were moving into the area. They didn't have to follow the Great Commission. People just came. And it's kind of the difference of an attitude of, he says, y'all come versus let's go. And y'all come is, hey, we've got a church. Here are our service times. If you're interested in coming, the doors are open, be our guest. And that's sort of just like a passive, we're here, here's our services, come join us if you'd like. That's y'all come. And he said it was in the South, which is why he used that y'all come.
Bryan, if I may
yeah.
use a sports term.
Let's do it.
They stopped training.
Yeah.
They're winning. Hey, man, we're winning every game 4-0. We don't have to train. We don't have to improve. We don't have to work on various aspects of our game. It's all coming to us. They, like you said, they didn't go to it.
Yeah.
They just.
And if we could just extend that a little further, imagine that they were able to dominate some sort of lower league, some sort of amateur league, and then suddenly they get bumped up to stiffer competition. So now the community isn't growing rapidly around them. So now it's harder to achieve the same result, but they haven't trained on how to live up to their full potential. They've kind of just accepted or coasted off of their past success. So now with a changing cultural environment of people are maybe more hostile towards Christianity. There's not as many people just randomly looking for a church to be part of. The community isn't growing. Their weakness in the area of evangelism was exposed by a changing cultural context. So they almost got sort of lulled into a false sense of, security or success. And then when the environment changed, they weren't prepared for a more missional context, right? So yeah, I think a sports analogy works really well there. So they had the y'all come attitude. They needed to develop a let's go mindset if they were going to continue to grow in the face of a changing demographic and cultural context. And that's where ice cream comes in. So they were sort of like an ice cream shop where they've got something great to offer. Everyone likes ice cream. Not everyone likes ice cream. Most people like ice cream. And if you don't, I love you, and there's a place for you here too. Ice cream is generally a popular thing. Okay, a lot of people like it. An ice cream shop. You've got something great to offer the community, but you have to advertise. You have to kind of put yourself out there. You're hoping that the customers will come to you. You've got something great to offer, but they have to know where it is. They have to decide to get in the car. They have to be willing to buckle all the kids in there, kind of get all of that going, and they have to show up to you, and then they'll get the ice cream. Now, that's very different than an ice cream truck, isn't it? Right? So you see, y'all perked up. Y'all perked up right there. We know that sound, because when you were a kid, you heard this sound in your house, and you came running out the door, right? I know. This goes for 30 seconds. The original video was 8 minutes long, but I thought that would be too distracting. So we all know that sound. We can all think to our childhood, the joy of running out and knowing I don't have to go to the store. The ice cream came to me. All right, so ice cream shop versus ice cream truck. One is a y'all come, and the other is a let's go. The church should be the ice cream truck. The church should be going out into the community, not just offering services that people can come to, but going into the community, meeting people where they are, and bringing, in this instance, ice cream represents Jesus, so we're kind of on weird theological ground here, but sharing the love of Jesus with people where they are. And if Twin Springs Church had developed the capacity to take the message into the community, to take the love of Jesus to people with a let's go mindset, they'd probably be in a much healthier spot now compared to kind of where they are. So thoughts on kind of that analogy. Does that resonate with you guys? Do you have any kind of insights, questions, comments about this church or anything before we move on? Yes, sir, Mr. Vaughn.
It doesn't look like they read the book and are understanding what Jesus told how to do, and they're not following his instructions. And most of us don't do that. I'm talking to me.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I'm in that same boat too. So here's my rationale for not being more evangelistic. I get up every week and tell hundreds of people about Jesus, and I teach them the Bible. I'm helping a lot of people grow closer to God. That's my rationale for not being more personally evangelistic with the people that I meet throughout the week at the grocery store, let's be honest, at the coffee shops that I go to, like all the places that I go. That's my rationale. Oh, I'm naturally an introvert. I don't want to impose my beliefs on other people. I'm a preacher. I do a lot anyway. So I rationalize a lot of inaction by saying, oh, well, I do this other thing, so I have permission to not engage in this conversation right now. I don't say those words out loud, but I can think back on the way that I've lived my life. And that's my rationalization. So we can get pretty good at rationalizing our inaction. That's something we'll talk about a little bit later. So we know, okay, this is sort of the mindset that we need to have. Jesus says, go, right? Don't just expect them to come to you. Go to them. But a lot of churches kind of fail to do that, and they try some other things instead. Maybe instead of following Jesus's, teaching or strategy on this, there's other things that churches try to do to keep pace or survive, and they're not that healthy. They might be somewhat effective for a moment, but they're not really all that Christ-like or biblical or effective long-term. This is just kind of my observations of what some churches try to do. Some churches they just kind of bank on brand loyalty, essentially, that there will be enough, if you're a Church of Christ, enough Church of Christ people moving into the area that naturally want to find a great Church of Christ to go to. So we're going to hope that enough Church of Christ people move into our area, or that our kids grow up and thinking, well, I grew up in a Church of Christ, I'm going to stay in the Church of Christ forever. We're kind of banking on like that loyalty to our group, that'll sustain us. But research shows people don't have a very strong commitment to the heritage they grew up with compared to previously. It's kind of like you grow up in the Church of Christ, but you might end up at a different kind of community church or Baptist church or Presbyterian church later in life. You don't really feel any kind of strong loyalty to the church you grew up in. That's a general trend across the board. So that might not be a great strategy. Another one that some churches do, it's an interesting choice. Is trash talk the other teams. So basically you loudly point out what every other church is doing wrong, so that everyone's like, well, I don't want to be part of the bad church. I guess I want to go to your church instead. Thank you so much for trash talking our church so that I now know how bad we are. I've seen that in Churches of Christ sometimes. I don't know if you have. And I don't want to trash talk them for trash talking others. But I've seen that, and it almost feels like the strategy is there's pretty much only one like real church, one like right church. So if we can educate people on how wrong their church is, they'll realize we're the right one. I think that's the mindset. It doesn't come across that way. It doesn't come across as helpful to people who are hearing it. It just comes across as overly judgmental. True story, when we were in California, we went to a church somewhere in the area that was offering a youth rally for junior high and high school students. And we had been to this before, and they used to have some pretty cool speakers that would, preach great messages for the students, the teens that are there, really relevant stuff. Well, there was a new preacher at the church, and they chose to have this new preacher as the youth rally speaker. And preachers don't always make good youth rally speakers because they're just kind of used to talking to a different audience with a different goal in mind. Some guys can do it pretty well. I think this guy probably needed a little bit more experience in the youth rally world because his messages were, here's why the Baptists are wrong, and here's why the Catholics are wrong, and here's why the Presbyterians are wrong. And imagine you're a youth group student and you're like, I'm on the fence about Jesus. I don't know if I really want to devote my life to Christ. I don't know if he's going to be there for me when I need him. I've got questions. I've got doubts. I'm trying to figure all this out. And the message is, you got to make sure you don't end up at a Lutheran church. There could be some value in saying, here's what we believe, and here's the honest disagreements we have with other churches, but probably not for the youth rally. And talking to my teens, because I was youth minister at the time, talking to my teens after that, we had to process that quite a bit and say, we don't want to assume anything about this speaker's motives, but we probably would want to have that conversation differently if we were going to talk about differences among churches at our church. So we kind of unpacked it, and we ended up leaving early because we weren't really thrilled with the way that youth rally was going. So we went home early and we kind of unpacked it together, and we were able to have a pretty good conversation. But I can guarantee you, for some churches, the strategy is trash talk the other teams. Other churches say, okay, we're not going to trash talk anyone. We're just going to be the best, coolest, hippest, most attractive church that there is. We want to be the Disneyland of churches, the happiest Sunday on earth, so that people can't resist coming here. Like, we want people to walk in and say, wow. And not necessarily, wow, I feel the Spirit of God in this place, although I'm sure they want that. But like, wow, they have an indoor pool that they use as their baptistry, and it's heated. That's awesome. I want to get baptized today. Like, they've got a coffee shop here. They've got fill in the blank with all the amenities. They just want to be the best of the best. And then the last one is, we know we can't be the best. We don't have the budget for that. We're not cool. We're just not. We're not going to be able to compete on that level. So let's just make sure we're not the worst. And it's that phrase, you don't have to outrun the bear, you just have to outrun your friends. So churches across the country are closing, Christianity is on the decline. As long as we can be a little bit better than the other churches in our area, we can bank on they're going to close first, and then we'll absorb their members. And then another church is going to close, we'll absorb their members. So we're not going to grow by reaching new people. We're just going to make sure we're not the first ones to close. If a few other churches have to die for us to sustain, that's a sacrifice we're willing to make. All right, so it's not let's succeed, it's just let's survive off of other churches closing and consolidating.
I was just going to say, let's rename that survival of the fittest.
Survival of the fittest, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that kind of makes sense. Now, you can understand a grain of logic in some of these, but none of these are really, let's go into the community and share the gospel the way that Jesus is teaching us. So pop quiz for you Bible scholars. What's the last thing that Jesus said to his disciples before he ascended to heaven? You remember? Yeah, there's a slightly different version of that in Acts. It's very similar to the Great Commission, right?
Said something about you'll be witnesses
Yeah.
here and there, all different.
The last thing he says in Matthew is the Great Commission. Luke writes the book of Luke and then the book of Acts. And in Acts chapter 1, right before he ascends, we've got this passage right here. The disciples gathered around him and asked Jesus, Lord, are you at this time going to restore the kingdom to Israel? And he said to them, it's not for you to know the times or dates the Father has set by his own authority, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. and then he ascends up to heaven. That's the last thing that he says. So the last thing is just this guiding principle of you're going to be witnesses, and witnesses are, it's the same word as to give testimony. So people who are called in to give verbal testimony to what they know to be true, what they've seen, what they've witnessed. It's also the same word as martyr, to die as a martyr. So what an interesting association that not only is this word testimony related to, or witness, testifying, sharing your witness, but it also implies a willingness to pay the ultimate price for sharing what you believe. So these are the last words that he shares with them. And if you read through Acts, the rest of Acts, it actually follows this exact geographical spread where they start in Jerusalem for the first 7 or 8 chapters. And then they head out into Judea and then in Samaria in Acts chapter 8. And then by the end of it, Acts 28, the Apostle Paul is preaching the gospel message in Rome, right in the heart of the pagan, idolatrous Roman Empire. So it starts with this group of a few hundred people in Jerusalem in Acts 1. By the end of it, I forget how many churches exactly were planted during that time span, but now we've got the gospel message being preached in what is metaphorically the ends of the earth, the heart of the evil Roman Empire. So it happens in Acts. That's exactly what we see. But it's not exactly the same thing that we see today. I think you look at some of their stories and they had a passion for the gospel, and they're probably more passionate about it then than a lot of Christians are today. And I think if you kind of read Acts and then you just look at the evangelism of most Christians, there's a pretty big difference. And I don't want anyone to feel like they're getting beat up, but we can read some of these stories and hopefully it convicts us about the need to follow in their footsteps. So my experience tells me that people know, like, we're supposed to do this, but there's a lot of ways that we rationalize not doing it. A lot of either sort of excuses we come up with, or we just kind of disassociate a little bit and don't think about it so we don't have to feel bad about not doing it. Kind of just, I don't know, all live in sort of denial about it a little bit. But Vaughn, you're going to say something. What's up?
What is the main function of church?
Why don't, do you have any thoughts to share on that?
It looks like Jesus spent his whole life helping other people.
Mm-hmm.
While he was here on earth.
Yeah.
He helped everybody. The ones that most of us thought didn't deserve to be helped. And is that what we need to do?
I think there's a both and. So for the people who are part of the community, it's to love them, serve them, nurture them, help them finish their race, finish their walk. But it's also, and reach out to new people and bring them into it too. Yeah, teach, save the lost. There really is a both and mission of the church, to care for those who are saved, pastoral ministry, to bless those who are hurting, to walk alongside Christians who are struggling, but also to go out and to seek and save the lost. You go and find that one lost sheep, and then you bring them into the fold, and then you care for the rest of the flock. You don't sort of just ignore the flock to constantly find new sheep. There's sort of a both and, right? Victor?
Right, I was just going to say the same thing. I'll tell a quick story. My first convert, I had a business associate, a young kid, and he started going to church with us, and I baptized him. And I saw him for like 3 weeks. I never saw him again because I didn't, and I was a fairly young Christian then too. I didn't do the second part. Yeah, we are to go make disciples, but it's not a check the box, punch the clock. Oh, I got my disciple, now on to the next disciple. We also have to nurture them, and he needed milk, and I didn't give him anything. I gave him water, maybe, as it were. And so I should have sat down with him, or gotten him with, probably not me, but other people who were more skilled at Bible studies and could help him start to grow. And he never really grew, and then he just never came back.
Yeah, if you take a close look at the Great Commission where Jesus says, go make disciples, he doesn't actually use the verb to make and then the noun disciples. It's not like a factory where you're punching out disciples and sending them out on a conveyor belt. It's a verb. He says, disciple the nations. To disciple someone is not just to make a convert. but it's to help someone develop a long-term relationship with Jesus. That involves leading them to make a decision to follow Jesus for the first time. But Disciple the Nations also includes helping them grow as a young Christian and helping them finish their race, to reach the finish line. That word, it's the whole journey, it has the whole journey in mind, which is why I sometimes struggle with highly evangelistic types of ministries that come in and they kind of put the hard sell on people to make a commitment to Jesus, and then they move on to the next city without kind of staying to help them develop roots, plug them into a local church. They're in some instances making converts without thinking about, are they going to still be a disciple 5 or 10 years from now? And so sometimes I struggle with that a little bit, but I think it is important to remember that Great Commission is not make a disciple in a factory and then your job is done. It's disciple the nations and help them develop that lifelong faith. Fawn?
How do I know I'm right in telling him what it is? I don't want to lead him in the wrong direction, so how do I know? So I think a lot of us are afraid to make that step for fear we are.
It's sort of a fear of, if I start talking to this person about Jesus and then they've got questions and I don't have great answers, I don't want to lead them astray. I don't want to think that I'm uninformed. I'm not sure how that conversation is going to go. Is that kind of the fear? Yeah, I'm with you on that. Even as someone who's pretty trained, in the Bible, I overthink what a potential conversation would be like all the time. But my mind goes back to a promise, and I don't know the exact citation. You guys, Bible scholars, you can help me find this. You can Google kind of these key words. But Jesus tells his disciples, when you are arrested and when you are brought before the authorities to give an account for why you're preaching in my name, don't worry about what you're going to say. The Holy Spirit will give you the right words at the right time to speak. And if we take that promise seriously, then our job is to not prepare in advance eloquent speeches that will persuade non-believers to suddenly see the light and accept Jesus as Lord. It's just to enter the conversation with a trust in the Holy Spirit. There's probably some basic things you might want to kind of rehearse about why you came to believe in Jesus and the blessing that it's been to follow him, and an invitation. Would you like to know more? Would you like to go to church with me? But you don't need to have theological speeches memorized. Now, Cheryl, I think I saw your hand first, and then we'll kind of bounce this around a little bit.
We need to get over the fact that we aren't going to convert people. We are going to give them the opportunity of their lifetime to accept the Lord as their Savior.
Yeah.
I think once we get off of our Christian high horse and think that we have the power to convert someone, we don't. The Word has the power to convert. And if their heart is right, at the right time, if they've been given the right information, they will make the right choice.
And sometimes you plant the seed and God will allow it to grow over time.
So, one of the things that I've learned is that it's not always going to happen in one conversation. You're going to be able to do that. And so it's important to be able to drop those seeds when you get that opportunity. Not forcing it on them, but just kind of because so many people today I know that I come in contact with are so caught up in their intellect, it hasn't come to their logic and reasoning of the way they see it from a human standpoint. But, when I address it from a spiritual standpoint and just kind of drop it in there, and then they see it in the way I live, then they can kind of see what I'm talking about. And so we can keep that ongoing conversation going. Another thing, just real quick, I notice a lot of churches today don't have new convert classes. After we baptize these people, we have to continue to teach them. I need to continue to learn, So I think that's another part of equation too, is to continue to be able to teach them while we're in the church, you know what I'm saying? Once we get them here, okay, it's like, okay, now you remember you're good. It's like, no, just continue to educate you on why we do it.
Yeah. Otherwise, church becomes the revolving door. Lots of people coming in, but they don't take root, so lots of people walk out the back door, right? Who else had hands? Jane?
Well, one of the things I learned as an instructor is when a student asks a question and I don't know the answer, I can say, I don't know. And let me look it up, maybe talk to somebody, and I'll get back to you.
Yeah, that's a tip that I learned when I worked at Apple. I worked at Apple for a summer, helped activate a bunch of iPhone 4s. just for summer job. But one of the things in the training was, if you don't know the answer to a question, don't make something up and look like an idiot later when they find out you're wrong. Because then you lose all credibility. They asked me a question, and if I didn't know, what they taught us to say was, I'm not sure. Let's find out together. Come on, let's go over to one of these computers. Let's jump on Google. Let's see if we can figure this out together. That way you're like admitting, I'm not sure, but let's find out. What a great approach to Christianity, too. They ask a question, I'm not sure. Let's find out together. Let's go to the Word. Let's see if we can find some of these key words. Let me text someone that I know. Like, phone a friend, right? On Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. Yeah. So that's maybe a good approach. Cambria.
I think it's also the responsibility of the new Christian and us to keep in contact with them to know if they're struggling, and then we can help them together. It's also their responsibility to go to the Word when they don't understand, because they've made that lifelong commitment to learn and to evolve as a Christian.
Yeah. Now, I saw a lot of hands. We got a good conversation going. Who else wanted to weigh in? That's a good point. Jeff?
I think a lot of times, especially the longer we've been walking, is we tend to forget our own reasons for why did we come to the Lord in the first place. And, you touched upon, hey, I don't know the answers. Let's go find them together. Christianity is relational.
Yeah.
And if we don't have it top of mind as to why we're following, are we truly following? And it's hard to convince someone else to walk the path with you if you're not really sure why you're walking that direction in the first place.
I did a little bit of a training seminar with Youth for Christ. Have you guys ever heard that, Youth for Christ? They've got outreach clubs on high school campuses, junior high campuses. So I was a youth minister. I was volunteering with them. And even though I'd been a full-time youth minister for many years, everyone has to go through their training on how to share your faith, which was actually really helpful. And they basically said, just tell your story. When you're telling people about Jesus, tell your story of who you were and what you were searching for before Jesus, and maybe some of the challenges you were facing. And then just share in a very simple way, I had this powerful but personal encounter with Jesus, and now here's what my life is like instead. And they said if you can get that down to like 30 seconds or a minute, then you're able to share your story in a way that's pretty powerful. And I had a coworker in California who he kind of made the point that when you're telling people about Jesus, if you can tell your story and how it impacted you and the change that you felt and the joy that you have in following Jesus, no one can turn around and say, well, you're wrong. You didn't feel that way. Jesus didn't help you like that. Because it's your story. You're sharing what actually happened with you. If you start to go into like, well, I believe that this theological truth, and here's the reason why, if you look at these three, points and the evidence behind the scientific, you kind of go down that path of right and wrong. Someone can jump in and start countering all of your arguments with other arguments. But if you just share your story and the way that Jesus has had an impact on your life and the transformation you've experienced, no one can tell you that's wrong. You're just sharing your story. And that's planting a seed, in their mind of the joy that can be found in following Christ. And it's done in a very non-confrontational way because you're not telling them they're wrong. You're just sharing the joy that you found in following Christ. Landon?
I think part of this is like, imagine going to a marriage conference for a weekend and all they talk about is your wedding day. That's it. For a whole weekend. That's all they do.
Mm-hmm.
Your marriage want to be very strong. And I think sometimes we can just get so focused on, well, let's get them baptized, let's let them believe, but then everything after that is up to them. No, if you were to go to a marriage conference and that's all they talk about, you would know better off. And so if we're not training them and making them disciples, they're no better off as well, or helping them along the process.
That's a great analogy. In the premarital counseling that I do, I'm certified to do a premarital course called SYMBIS, Save Your Marriage Before It Starts. One of the points they make is that too many couples spend all of their time, effort, energy, and money planning for the wedding, but not preparing for the marriage. So just your exact point, that all that focus is on the event, and then a healthy marriage is almost an afterthought. So if a church was all about converting people, leading people to Christ, make the decision, do the thing, and then you don't do any kind of follow-up, you're just making the same mistake in a different arena, different area of life.
I want to tie everything together with Jesus' parable of the sowing and the reaping. I think a lot of these excuses are the different soils, and that's what we tend to do. We go, well, I can't do this because, this is going to happen, that's going to happen. And like Cheryl said, and you said, it's all about seed planting. That's what we're supposed to be, seed planters. If the guy in the parable, the sowing and the reaping, said, oh wait, I have to analyze all this soil first, and he spent all this time analyzing the soil, he never would have planted the seeds and nothing would have grown. So we just have to go out there, and it's hard. I'm looking at me here, and just plant the seed and not worry about the results.
Yeah. Your job is to share the message. You're not responsible with what happens after that. You can't control how a person responds, but you can control whether or not you share it. And I think if we start to define success in evangelism as I was willing to share, I spoke up, even if 99 out of 100 people showed no interest, you've done your job, which is to share the message. And that one person, the life is going to be transformed. And if you're willing to pay the price of getting turned down 99 times, that's going to be worth the one person who says yes, right? Your handout has some of the excuses that or rationalizations that Tom Rainer talks about in the book about why not. He says that maybe we just have bad theology, maybe even younger people in particular, this mindset of all paths ultimately lead to God. And it doesn't really matter what you believe as long as you have love in your heart. Your truth is your truth. So all paths ultimately lead to salvation. We don't really need to go tell people about Jesus specifically because there's a lot of different ways that a person can be saved. So if you're kind of wishy-washy on that idea of the exclusivity of needing Jesus specifically, then you might not feel compelled to tell people about Jesus if you feel like any religion leads to heaven ultimately. So he says maybe we've got some poor theology and we don't really see it as an urgent need. But then the rationalization is like, oh, it's not my gift. I'm gifted more in like hospitality and service, but not speaking up. That's why we pay ministers. Why should I have to do the work if we pay other people to do this work for us? I'm too busy. I don't want to be pushy. I'm an introvert. And there's like a grain of truth in all of that. But when you think about what's at stake and the urgency of the mission, and someone misses out on an opportunity to hear the gospel because it's not your gift and you're an introvert, that's a little convicting to think about, So those are some of the things that he talks about. The story that he would have us think about is Acts 4, when Peter and John are thrown in prison and warned not to speak about Jesus again, threatened with more persecution and beatings. And their response is in Acts 4, we cannot help speaking about what we have seen and heard. We're compelled to preach. Nothing is going to stop us. Not prison, not persecution, not the threat of being kicked out of the synagogue, cut off from our people. You can't stop us. You can't stop the message. Paul talks about being compelled by the love of Christ, compelled to preach the gospel. And then you compare that attitude with, I'm kind of an introvert, so I don't really think that's what I'm going to do. I don't want us to feel guilty about that, but I think it's convicting to just kind of do a side-by-side with their passion for evangelism and kind of the approach that we have sometimes. So here's what we can do. We can pray for opportunities, that God would send us the right people at the right time. And when you pray for the opportunities, you also have to intentionally look for those opportunities. Okay, don't pray for it and then put your blinders on, stay home all day. Invite people to church. It's really simple. Most people are willing to go to church with a friend. And then most people are willing to come back if the church is friendly. That's some statistics that I learned. I took a class on evangelism in seminary, and I was really surprised to hear that. And then be prepared to speak when the opportunities come. And Vaughn, that kind of goes back to your point of there's certain things that you should kind of be prepared to talk about why you came to faith and what you love about Jesus. But you don't need to have a theological textbook memorized in order to prove your faith. Just focus on the basics. And maybe that's something we can talk about more with our Flex Day at the end of the summer or something like that. But I think there's some need on training people how to have conversations like that. I hope you like the little comic right there. Look carefully. It's pretty funny. You get a chuckle out of that. That's our class for today. I hope that there's something in there that kind of inspires you to maybe look for an opportunity today. Share the love of Jesus with someone. All right. Thanks, guys.